By the time you watch this video, I don't know how many days it will have been. How many days is it since Israel began its most recent assault on Gaza? The one that began on that unforgettable day in October 2023. Go on, pause the video a second, look it up, sit with it. Today, the day that I begin to record the script, it's been 151 days. 5 months, and over 30,000 people dead. Palestinians, to be precise, murdered by Israel if we're really interested in precision. In the time that it took to finish this project, here are the numbers a week before the video's release. 252 days, over 8 months, and at least 37,000 dead, with these numbers being far from the reality because Palestinians experiencing this genocide have been struggling to record their dead. Today, the day that you watch this video, I don't know how many more will have been murdered. I don't know how many will be murdered in the time it takes for you to listen to my voice. But just stay with me for a minute to listen, to learn, and to reflect. And I hope that when this video is over, we'll both do more, everything that we possibly can, to stop this. As many of you know, this didn't start in October 2023. The Palestinian people have been suffering the consequences of somebody else's actions, of European imperialism and settler colonization specifically, for the past 100 years or more. Settler colonialism is necessarily genocidal. To create a settler colony, the settler is constantly trying to eradicate or dominate the indigenous. So that explains this current 151-day genocidal campaign. If you've been feeling anything like I have over the past few months, then we're also talking about 151 days of your mind and, in some regards, your body trying to process what you're witnessing day after day. I think bearing witness is important. I think it's necessary. I think if we do it actively, then witnessing injustice becomes battling injustice. But I think if we do so passively, then witnessing injustice just becomes an exercise in self-pity or even in something much darker. Every day we have to contend with violence on a scale so enormous, so unnatural, that our bodies struggle to hold the shape of it, the shape of such cosmic grief. One minute I look at a number, 30,000 murdered, and my mind is empty. The next minute it's flooded with images. A grandfather that lovingly cradles his unbreathing granddaughter, the soul of his soul. A father and a doctor preparing to amputate his daughter's leg without sanitation, without anesthetic, on the kitchen table where they used to laugh and share meals. A 13-year-old girl whose eyes are a blackened reflection of the burst capillaries in her head, the vessels that ruptured in the head that was crushed by the bulldozer that killed her family. But games. How do I go from genocide to games? It's not as hard as you'd think. There's the material complicity of the games industry. Perhaps most obviously the fact that we can draw a straight line between the militarization of the games industry and the bombs dropping on Gaza. We have a Gamers for Gaza resource that you can check out if you want to learn more. It's linked in the description below. What about Palestinian voices in games? I ask because in order to get away with the genocide, the powers that be have to do this thing that Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman call manufacturing consent. Chomsky and Herman argue that mass media serves a propaganda function, which covertly convinces us that, yeah, genocide is okay, actually. Those people deserve it. And Chomsky and Herman are talking about news media mostly, but entertainment media is undoubtedly a part of the picture when it comes to manufacturing consent for genocide. So I ask again, what about Palestinian voices in games? Unfortunately, there are various factors which contribute to the scarcity of Palestinian voices in games. One is censorship. The vast majority of Palestinians live in exile thanks to consistent campaigns of forced displacement by Israel since the Nakba in 1948, meaning catastrophe in Arabic. Some Palestinians in exile may have the resource, creativity, and interest to make games, but face brutal censorship by corporations, institutions, and governments. But perhaps the biggest reason for the scarcity of Palestinian voices in games is a lot more material. Palestinians living on the ground across the land of historic Palestine, whether it's in Gaza, East Jerusalem, or the West Bank, or even in the settler colony of Israel 48, they face insecurity, poverty, mass incarceration, routine bombardments, power blackouts, to name only a few, all imposed on them by the settler colonial apartheid regime of Israel. And in these circumstances, the proportion of the Palestinian population with a PC or a games console to play games, let alone make them, is much, much slimmer than ours. You need more resources to make a game than to write a poem, so no wonder there are more poets than game developers in Palestine. But these voices are, of course, not absent. We were fortunate enough to co-host a game jam late last year titled Towards a Free Palestine, and this drew such moving, thought-provoking, searingly creative entries made on limited time and on limited resources to an outstanding quality. We've uploaded videos of ourselves playing these entries and talking about them here on YouTube, so you can have a look at that if you're interested. But more importantly, play these games for yourselves. Finally, and pertinently to the topic of this video, let's turn to the cultural mainstream and its depiction of Palestine and Palestinians, which often exists, importantly, without the presence of their voices. In games, the mainstream is certainly still dominated by orientalist, racist images of Arabs and folks of all ethnicities from the Swana region. That stands for Southwest Asia and North Africa, as Middle East is a quite colonial term and doesn't encompass the whole area. In the specific case of Palestine, Palestinians are an indigenous population, and the 76-year genocidal project against them includes what's known as cultural genocide. That's the project of erasing any and every trace of the existence of Palestine and the Palestinian people. At the same time, the orientalised image of the Holy Land is writ large in the Western cultural imagination, an image which not only has little to do with the material realities of being Palestinian, but is deeply rooted in a sinister history of attempts to colonise the land, a history which spans more than 1,000 years. A couple of years ago, I replayed Assassin's Creed for the first time in maybe over a decade. It's a game which made a huge impression on me as a child, back when it came out in 2007. This time I was struck by something I'd never considered before: my ability to walk through the city of Al-Quds, or Jerusalem, with relative ease. How heartbreaking is it that a Palestinian, perhaps a Muslim from the city of Al-Quds now living in exile, can walk through a virtual representation of the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, but can't go home to pray there. In an interview with Assassin's Creed in-house historian Maxime Durand, who was hired by Ubisoft during the development of Assassin's Creed 3, Jake Ray reports, "When Maxime Durand heard the news on April 15th, Assassin's Creed Unity was the last thing on his mind. At first he thought it was a joke, but when he realized that the Cathedral of Notre Dame de Paris was actually burning, he was at a loss for words. Then he saw the reaction from the Assassin's Creed community on social media, sharing their love for the recreation of the cathedral and their experiences with the game. That was quite overwhelming to see that people cared and knew and loved the history of a monument because they had played it in a video game," said Durand, who works as a franchise historian at Ubisoft Montreal. "It represents so much that the cathedral is worth saving, and if a video game can spark interest into caring about historic landmarks, I am just super happy about it." The painstaking effort to recreate the cathedral and the history surrounding it allowed players to mourn its partial destruction. In turn, Ubisoft donated more than $500,000 to the restoration efforts, and even made Assassin's Creed Unity free to play on PC, so that everyone who wanted to could experience the cathedral in all its digital glory. Just as millions of people visit the cathedral each year, millions of people play Assassin's Creed, sparking more interest in the history behind whatever civilization they are experiencing in each entry. Because of that, the Assassin's Creed community responded with sadness and shock for a building that many of them had only experienced in a video game. Do you see what I'm getting at yet? I'm bringing this up to point to a double standard that hit me like a ton of bricks when I read this. When the Notre Dame fire occurred in 2019, I certainly thought about it then, and since October 2023, folks have pointed it out now. While the Western world considers the Notre Dame to be worth saving, the destruction of the oldest churches in the world by Israel in its campaign to eviscerate every trace of Palestinian life in Gaza evokes no emotion, no outcry, no outpouring of funds. Ubisoft donated $500,000 to restore the Notre Dame and has given roundly $0 to Palestinian relief efforts. Reading this interview, I thought of Al-Aqsa again, and I thought no one would care. I mean, I would care. Al-Aqsa is one of the holiest sites in Islam, and when Palestine is free, inshallah, but not until then, I would love to visit it someday. But no one in the Western world would care if Al-Aqsa was destroyed. And many of them have been there in a video game, the first Assassin's Creed, to be precise, but they wouldn't care. It's a feeling I've had for months, after the many nights I've cried myself to sleep mourning Palestinian lives, that no one cares. Why do they care about the Notre Dame and not Al-Aqsa? Well, let's talk about experiencing Al-Aqsa in the game, strolling through the mosque compound and maybe even scaling the Dome of the Rock. When we move through games, we move through worlds, through structures, and of course they have limitations. Virtually, we navigate our bodies through context. How we're able to move, how we choose to move, is almost completely dependent on that context. So living in the physical world is kind of like that too, which makes movement deeply political. So the big question, in Assassin's Creed, how do you, as Altair, or as some people would call him, Altair, quite possibly a Palestinian protagonist, though it's never explicitly stated, move through Palestine? And how does the experience of movement in Assassin's Creed compare to the lived experience of Palestinians back in the 12th century and now? Hello, and welcome to Game Assist. I'm Sara, pronouns they, them, and she, her. Do excuse me for a moment while I do the classic content creator thing of asking you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell if you're interested in more content like this. Oh, and if you really like what we can do, you can consider joining our Patreon community for just £1 a month, buying us a coffee on Ko-fi. All of our links are in the description. I'm also going to make the quick disclaimer here, I do my best to pronounce Arabic in this video. Despite the fact that Arabic is my mother's native language, I'm not fluent in it, but I do try my best. At the same time, I will be making fun of the way that white people pronounce Arabic, which I know is kind of throwing stones from glass houses, but just let me have my fun. This video will contain spoilers for Assassin's Creed, of course, the first one, and maybe the second one, and maybe also the third one, and also Mirage, and possibly some of the others too. But before we get stuck in, a couple of brief content warnings. In this video we're going to be discussing genocide, settler colonialism, anti-Palestinian racism and violence, orientalism, militarism and policing, and state violence. There are also going to be depictions of blood, death, and police and military violence on screen. This is going to be a long video, but I really encourage sticking around, because after I go through my analysis, you're going to get to hear directly from Palestinians working in the games industry, and you're really going to want to hear what they have to say. Back in 2007, Assassin's Creed was funky and fresh, in many ways something which had never been done before, something which captured the imaginations of millions. Now it's just the first in a 17-year-old franchise with entirely too many installments. I actually didn't know this until I was researching for this video, but the Assassin's Creed origin story is actually connected to my own gamer origin story. By 2007, I'd become really interested in the Prince of Persia trilogy, which included The Sands of Time, Warrior Within, and The Two Thrones. It might be the rose-tinted glasses talking, but I remember them being very cool, and when I was 10, I liked everything my cool older brother liked. Well, it's almost certainly the rose-tinted glasses, because I tried to replay Sands of Time a few years ago, and I found my jaw dropping at how blatant the orientalism was. But I think at the time I was also enthralled by the trilogy's clearly spicy, brown, protagonist. At 10 years old, homogenizing Orientalist fantasies were more or less the only places I saw my reflection, at least in Anglophone media. I was a big fan of Aladdin back then too, and I was all too happy to survive on crumbs. Assassin's Creed was originally meant to be a Prince of Persia installment, a new entry into the IP for the new generation of consoles, which at that time was the PS3 and the Xbox 360. During the creative process, the developers decided to take a risk and pivot, developing a totally new IP. For the Prince of Persia initiated, the marks of that franchise on Assassin's Creed are unmistakable, from the free-running gameplay to the orientalism. This is interesting for a few reasons, and I'll come back to it, particularly because the Prince of Persia series has made a resurgence this year with its new title, The Lost Crown, not long after the release of Assassin's Creed's latest title, Mirage, which its creators describe as a love letter to the original game. But the original Assassin's Creed, once established as a new franchise, also took on a new narrative approach, which is now integral to its brand identity. In contrast to the openly fantastical Prince of Persia, Assassin's Creed would gain a reputation for its rootedness in historical fiction, with, at least from a marketing perspective, an emphasis on the historical and a quietude about the fiction. The original game is set in the year 1191, in the thick of the Third Crusade, which is almost certainly the most famous one both in Europe and across Southwest Asia. The Crusades were, according to common knowledge in the Western world, a religious war waged by West European Christians in order to wrest the holy city of Jerusalem away from the heathen Muslims who had occupied it for centuries, a narrative we'll interrogate momentarily. But Jerusalem, which its indigenous people have called Al-Quds or Beit al-Maqdis since about the 7th or 8th century, is indeed a holy site in each of the Abrahamic faiths, for many reasons. This Palestinian city, as you might already be thinking, is also at the center of struggles to colonize and to resist colonization today. So by representing a historical moment which invokes these parallels, Assassin's Creed offers us an opportunity to focus on just that, the politics of colonization and resistance during the Crusades and today. Okay, but what even were the Crusades anyway? We've seen Kingdom of Heaven. We know this is about how Christians and Muslims eternally hate each other and sometimes fight with swords and cool armor. But is there more to it than that? Surely there is, especially if we start with the question, what in the world got the Christians in Europe suddenly juiced up on the idea of holy war when Islamic empires had already been in charge of Jerusalem since the 7th century? Clearly, this question alone muddies the idea that this was just about religion. The pure religious conflict narrative overlooks a crucial fact, which is that Christian communities were indeed a part of Islamic empires. During centuries of Abbasid rule, non-Muslims faced a religious tax but were not violently persecuted, and in fact often played important roles in Islamic society. We could and should debate the intricacies of Abbasid society and Islamic law all day, but what's important here is to demonstrate that Palestinian or Syrian, usually Orthodox Christians, weren't the right kind of Christian according to Western European Catholic invaders. So why holy war? Late in the 11th century, Byzantine Emperor Alexios I found himself and his territory threatened by the Seljuk Turks, a rising Islamic faction which more or less had its hooks in Abbasid territory as well. The Seljuks were expanding their empire across Southwest Asia and inching closer to Constantinople, the Byzantine capital. As the Byzantine Empire was a Christian empire, Alexios called on his Western European allies for help. The Pope at the time, Urban II, convened the Council of Clermont in France in the year 1095 to respond to Alexios' request, and the council decided to call for holy war. Crucially, the word crusade and the word crusader were not in use at this time, so henceforth the term Frank is used to refer to the Western Europeans. As recorded by Robert the Monk, Pope Urban II delivered a speech to hundreds in Clermont to announce holy war, a speech which is worth pausing on to read together because its rhetoric might look familiar to you. O race of Franks, race from across the mountains, race beloved and chosen by God, as is clear from many of your works, set apart from all other nations by the situation of your country, as well as by your Catholic faith, and the honor which you render to the Holy Church. To you our discourse is addressed, and for you our exhortations are intended. Okay, so we're starting strong by addressing you, the Franks, as a superior race. From the confines of Jerusalem and from the city of Constantinople, a grievous report has gone forth and has repeatedly been brought to our ears, namely that a race from the kingdom of the Persians, an accursed race, a race wholly alienated from God, a generation that set not their heart aright and whose spirit was not steadfast with God, violently invaded the lands of those Christians and has depopulated them by pillage and fire. They have led away a part of the captives into their own country, and a part they have killed by cruel tortures. They have either destroyed the churches of God or appropriated them for the rights of their own religion. Okay, now we're A, constructing an inferior race, and B, creating a false but emotionally resonant narrative about their barbarism. As it would turn out, this propaganda would foretell the behavior of the Franks, not the other way around. Urban II mentions Persians here, but Persians, Arabs, Turks, Kurds, and so on are all being painted with the same broad stroke as a homogeneous racial group. This inferior racial group is evil. Importantly, they're not Christian, forgetting for a moment that the Christian god and the Muslim god are the same one. And as these barbarous Persians have violently invaded the lands of those Christians, presumably any land that is theirs is not really theirs, it's stolen, which makes it justified for us to take it from them. Enter upon the road to the holy sepulchre, wrest that land from the wicked race and subject it to yourselves. That land which, as the scripture says, floweth with milk and honey, was given by God into the power of the children of Israel. Jerusalem is the center of the earth. The land is fruitful above all others, like another paradise of delights. This royal city, however, situated at the center of the earth, is now held captive by the enemies of Christ and is subjected by those who do not know God to the worship of the heathen. She seeks, therefore, and desires to be liberated and ceases not to implore you to come to her aid. From you especially she asks succor, because as we have already said, God has conferred upon you above all other nations great glory in arms. Accordingly, undertake this journey eagerly for the remission of your sins, with the assurance of the reward of imperishable glory in the kingdom of heaven. Hey, it's the name of the movie! Okay, a couple of key points here. Pope Urban II gives the Franks a specific object, the city of Jerusalem. The Franks are to take the city for themselves, but to think of themselves as liberators, the way any colonizer thinks of themselves, really. Now, as you might be thinking, this is getting a little bit beyond Alexio's cry for help, because Urban is enticing his listeners to a fertile paradise, a land of milk and honey. So there's material gain to be had from the endeavor. And the trump card, he's assuring forgiveness for your sins and an advance on your place in the kingdom of heaven. As you'd expect, Urban's speech attracted Frankish knights and lesser lords who had nothing to inherit, but might seek wealth and glory in the kingdom of heaven. It also attracted the poor and the damned, who might find salvation on the journey away from their grim lives of serfdom under the aristocracy of Western European monarchies. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children set out for Jerusalem that year, in 1095, looting and pillaging through Europe on their way, and then began the Crusades. After arriving in the allied city of Constantinople, they proceeded with offensive marches into Nicaea, then Dorylaeum, then Antioch. After a lengthy siege, the Franks secured Antioch thanks to an infamous betrayal from inside the city. The chaos, namely the lack of planning and resources at their disposal, meant the Franks had to hit Jerusalem hard or go home. So hit Jerusalem hard they did, laying brutal siege to the city for several weeks. When the Franks finally took Jerusalem, it resulted in one of the most awful massacres of medieval history. Palestinian Muslims, Jews, and Christians were slaughtered indiscriminately. Famously, the Muslims that retreated into Al-Aqsa Mosque were butchered, as were the Christians that retreated into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Greek Orthodox liturgies were replaced with Catholic ones, and Al-Aqsa Mosque was turned into stables. This episode would colour the way that Franks were remembered by the indigenous people of the region for centuries to come. After the Franks conquered Jerusalem in blood, they captured more territories, many through the surrender of Muslim leaders who had strong, devolved regional powers in their own principalities, and this led to the foundation of the Frankish states. At their height, these included the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which at its largest spanned all of modern historic Palestine, from Akka in the north to Gaza in the south. The other Frankish states included the County of Tripoli, Principality of Antioch, and County of Edessa. These three states are located in parts of what is now Turkey, Syria, and Lebanon. Despite the Crusades purportedly being a response to Alexio's request from Greek Orthodoxy to its Catholic allies, the Catholic Church and Frankish monarchies were clearly interested in the opportunity to expand their wealth and territory. Other historians have argued this, and I'm inclined to agree, for two main reasons. Firstly, the goal of Jerusalem had nothing to do with Alexios' desire to protect his empire from the Seljuks. Secondly, if Jerusalem had been the only goal, they would have stopped at Jerusalem. There's a military and strategic case to be made that in order to secure Jerusalem, one would have to secure surrounding territories. But regardless of intent, which will never be easy to read, does this not become a colonial project either way by virtue of its actions? And haven't all colonial projects claimed some kind of moral, ethical, religious justification? The Franks proceeded to build a new system of rule in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, one which expelled Muslims, Jews, and Eastern Christians, and they launched an enormous campaign to attract Frankish settlement in the region and build an exclusively Catholic Western European society. The disenfranchised of Europe flocked in their thousands, escaping serfdom and poverty. In the Frankish states, unprecedented social mobility was possible. Your European social status dissipated in the Holy Land, where you could be whoever you wanted to be. The lesser nobles of Europe became kings of the Levant. This is certainly a good place to make a parallel with modern Zionism, a project which propagandized to disenfranchised and persecuted Jews across Europe, promising them a land of safety and opportunity, free of violent European anti-Semitism, at the low cost of killing and displacing the natives. Though one stark point of difference might be that, despite the Frankish intention of building Latin-speaking, essentially proto-settler colonies, there quickly emerged concern around settlers going native, which is to say, many European settlers enjoyed the quality of life in Palestine and Syria, which was home to technological marvels beyond their imaginations, and they respected the people that lived there enough to want to assimilate instead of conquer. But Sara, why are you talking about Palestine? Was there a Palestine in the 11th and 12th centuries? In fact, yes, there was. As Nur Masalha demonstrates with vast amounts of evidence in his 4,000-year history of Palestine, the name Palestine is recorded as early as the Late Bronze Age, 3,200 years ago. In the Roman, Byzantine, and Islamic periods, there was a province named Palestine which had administrative status, though its borders and its ethnic, religious, and political demographics and structure, of course, shifted over time. The land has long been called Palestine, and the people who lived there have long referred to themselves as Palestinian. Variants of the name include the Egyptian Peliset, Assyrian Pilistu, Greek Philistia, and Latin Palestina. Herodotus first recording the name Palestine in the 5th century BC. If you've been following journalists from Gaza since October, you'll know the name of 22-year-old Plestia el-Aqad. Named for the ancient Greek, in keeping with a modern Palestinian tradition which seeks to preserve Palestinian place names that are under attack by the Zionist settler colonial project by giving these names to their children. If you're at all familiar with the Bible, you may have heard of the Philistines, that is, the people of Philistia. That's right, those are Palestinians. And the modern word Philistine is an insult meant to imply that someone is hostile to culture. Wow! Every day you learn something racist. At the time the Frankish invasions began, the land of historic Palestine was part of an Abbasid administrative province called Philistine. And Philistine, or Palestine, as some of you might know, is the modern Arabic for Palestine. So yes, at the time of the Crusades, there was a land called Palestine. When I talk about Palestine historically, I refer to the continuity of this geography and national identity between that historic period and now. This is important to know because Zionism wants to erase Palestine and Palestinians. And it's important because none of the scholarship, criticism, interviews, or any of the writing I could find on Assassin's Creed mentioned the game being set in Palestine even once. References are consistently to the Holy Land or to the Levant region. I think it's vital we push back on this as an act of resistance to colonization, to insist on the right of a specific Palestinian history and existence to be recognized and preserved. While there are those who would argue that Palestine was not a relevant term then, I've just argued that it absolutely was. And even if it wasn't, while Palestinian identity is also part of regional Arab identity, making Palestinians invisible by homogenizing them or flattening them into a regional identity erases their specific identities and histories, and it contributes to cultural genocide. Now, when Jerusalem fell to the Franks in 1099, some survivors journeyed to Damascus to tell of their plight, where the Muslim scholar al-Kharroubi was so moved he led them to the capital of the Abbasid Khalifa in Baghdad. He cursed the hypocrisy of the Muslims for turning a blind eye to the slaughter of their siblings in Palestine, too caught up in their internal skirmishes, whether between regional rulers with devolved powers, or between Sunni and Shia, or between Abbasid, Fatimid, and Seljuk. Disunity across the region meant that a coordinated response to the Frankish invasions wasn't yet possible. The Franks relied on this disunity, often dealing separately with Muslim principalities willing to surrender or strike treaties. Internal divisions were such that sometimes Muslim leaders would side with Franks over their rival Muslims. There are many who would also draw parallels between this and the current situation, as many Arab nations that surround Palestine have taken to normalizing relations with Israel, and this is part of the reason that it's a struggle to fight back. Eventually, mounting pressure caused the Abbasid Khalifa to seek help from the Seljuk Sultan, who stopped a Frankish siege of Aleppo in its tracks. Throughout the 12th century, the Muslim resistance would slowly grow, and the unity of the Islamic world with it. A thorn in the side of those who fought for unity in the Islamic world in the face of an existential threat, the Frankish invaders, was a small Shia sect, al-Batiniyya, which would colloquially come to be referred to as al-Hashashin, or the Assassins. That's right, this is the basis for the Assassin's Order in the video game. This sect, the real historical one that is, undertook various political assassinations within the Muslim world, generally targeting Sunni leaders of the Abbasid Khalifa and Seljuk Sultanate. In spite of this, the first half of the century saw the rise of political and military leaders like Imad-ad-Din Zengi, who recaptured Edessa from the Franks. His successor, Nur-ad-Din Zengi, whose affectionate moniker, Nur-ad-Din, means light of the faith, was a devout man who made it his mission to unite the Muslim world from Baghdad to Cairo. It was in service of Nur-ad-Din that a Kurdish general named Yusuf ibn Ayyub would come to reconquer Jerusalem from the Franks and to earn the name Salah ad-Din Ayyubi, or, as they call him in the Western world, Saladin. The founder of the Ayyubid dynasty. I don't know what Saladin means, but Salah ad-Din means the righteousness of the faith. This takes us to the period Assassin's Creed is set in, so the history lesson's going to be cut short soon, I promise. But I've got my sources in full down in the description if you do want to learn more about the Crusades. The Franks were turning an eye to Egypt and trying to broker a deal with the Fatimids, when Salah ad-Din's uncle captured Cairo and handed his role as vizier to his nephew. Salah ad-Din became the man to abolish the Shia Fatimid Khalifa in Egypt and to declare its loyalty to Baghdad. With the united southern Syria and now Egypt, Salah ad-Din's domain surrounded the Frankish states to the south, north, and east. To their west, of course, was the Mediterranean Sea. At this time, a Frankish noble named Reynold of Chatillon allied with the military order called the Knights Templar. Yes, these are the guys that the Templars in the game are based on. And Chatillon declared his intent to lay waste to Islam's holiest sites, though he was stopped in his tracks. Meanwhile, Jerusalem's king, who Salah ad-Din had shared a temporary truce with, died, and his sister's wife, Guy de Lusignan, became king, and he didn't fancy keeping up a truce with Salah ad-Din. In 1187, almost a century after the first Frankish invasion, Salah ad-Din decided it was time to take Jerusalem, first laying siege to the fortress of Tiberias, then luring the Frankish forces into the Horns of Hattin, where they were blocked off from the water and supply lines in the middle of the summer heat. Salah ad-Din liberated Jerusalem after this feat of military and strategic prowess, and famously he showed mercy to contrast the Franks who had captured Jerusalem in 1099. He allowed the Franks to leave the city if they paid an exit tax, but when the wealthy refused to pay on behalf of the poor, Salah ad-Din paid their tax himself. This was a huge turning point, and it would be followed by the recapture of other Palestinian cities, like Gaza, Asqalan, Jaffa, and Akka. At the same time, the monarchs back in Europe were launching another holy war, and among their ranks was King Richard I, known as the Lionheart, who arrived in 1191 to capture Akka from Salah ad-Din alongside other coastal territories including Arsuf. Richard left by 1192 when he heard his throne in England was under threat, and Salah ad-Din died shortly after. A century later, another Muslim empire, the Mamluks, would drive the Franks out of the region once and for all, abolishing the Frankish states. Now, as I've already alluded to, the Crusades can be considered as an early attempt at European settler colonization in Southwest Asia. This is a major difference from the traditional framing of the Crusades as a religious conflict, a term which implies that both sides are equal and opposite, that there's no intent to dominate or subjugate, and that there's no attempt to create a society fundamentally predicated on a racial power structure. Decolonized Palestine does a great job of explaining on their website how the religious conflict narrative is deployed by Zionism to obscure the material reality on the ground since before 1948, which is the creation of a settler colonial society on top of Palestinian land, which is only made possible by the mass displacement and massacre of indigenous Palestinians. I'm wary of directly comparing the Crusades to modern Zionism as an exact one-to-one parallel, but the similarities are worth noting for at least one striking reason. That reason is that the Crusades live on in the Western imagination today, and not coincidentally seem always connected to Western imperialism or colonization. From the height of the Crusades onwards, maps were commissioned and produced showing Palestine with the desire of promoting more crusading campaigns or projecting European power. The term Holy Land is part of an English parlance that is rooted particularly in this context. In the 18th and 19th century, printing made it possible to circulate these maps widely, and at the same time the 19th century saw a rise in Romantic art depicting the Crusades as something noble and aspirational. This is absolutely no coincidence, considering what would follow in the early 20th century, the establishment of British colonial rule in Palestine from 1918 to 1948. During these 3 decades, Britain set up the infrastructure that made it possible for the Zionist project to begin its settler colonization of Palestine. In fact, Frankish crusaders themselves were involved in at least one identical project to modern Zionists, the attempted erasure of indigenous place names while attempting to find and assign biblical place names in their stead. As recently as 2001, George Bush used the language of crusading to announce the campaigns that would devastate Iraq, Afghanistan, surrounding countries, and the global Muslim diaspora for decades to come.
This crusade, this war on terrorism, is going to take a while, and the American people must be patient.
Even where we have Western texts which are slightly less romanticized and slightly more critical, like Ridley Scott's infamous Kingdom of Heaven or Assassin's Creed itself, they are ultimately caught up in a both sides narrative which reinforces the status quo of romanticizing the European, orientalizing the Southwest Asian, and obscuring European colonialism. And how do Arabs and other Southwest Asians remember the Crusades? In his history titled The Crusades Through Arab Eyes, Amin Maalouf writes that today, the political and religious leaders of the Arab world constantly refer to Saladin, Jesus Christ, Salah ad-Din, to the fall of Jerusalem and its recapture. In the popular mind, and in some official discourse too, Israel is regarded as a new crusader state, which is to say that in Europe the dominant story is that of a noble European colonizer, or at least a noble European suffering in regret of colonization, while in the Arab world the picture is of Salah ad-Din leading the charge to liberate colonized lands from their violent, bloodthirsty, and fair-haired colonizer. In the game, when we first meet our protagonist, Al-Tahir ibn Ahad, Assassin's Creed drops us in the Temple of Solomon in the year 1191, which is an interesting choice because it should be noted that no archaeological remains evidencing the existence of this biblical temple have been found. In the game, you, Al-Tahir, are a member of an order named the Assassin's Order. Mind you, as I mentioned, the Assassin's Order was a real thing, but the Assassins of history and the Assassins of the game have very little in common. The historic Assassins were an Ismaili sect of Shia Muslims. We don't have time to get into the intricacies of Shia theology or specifically Ismaili theology here, but in a nutshell, the sect's mission was to enshrine Shia dominance and to displace the Sunni Abbasids and Seljuks. They often preferred allying with the Franks to allying with Sunni Muslims. The sect engaged in political assassinations, and their MO was to use discipline, disguise, and subterfuge to orchestrate public executions that would result in the immediate death of the assassin, who would be killed right away by city guards. Some contemporaneous Arab and Persian historians refer to this sect as al-Batiniya, which is a theological term, but it's presumed that the name al-Hashashiyin came about based on the gossip that you'd have to be high on hashish to be as crazy as them. This is where the modern English term assassin comes from, and the craziness referred to was their fervent devotion to their mission to the point that they didn't fear death. In 1187, for example, the story goes that when Richard I's nephew, Count Henry of Champagne, was given rule of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, he sought a truce with al-Hashashiyin. To prove themselves to Henry, the Grand Master of the Order commanded his followers to throw themselves off the fort ramparts, and obviously they died, rather than landing in a soft bed of hay unharmed like they do in Assassin's Creed. This and the whole subterfuge and public execution thing should give you a strong sense of the inspiration for the game. These committed assassins were called fidaiyin, which means self-sacrificers. The term fidaiyin, coincidentally, is used today to describe guerrilla fighters resisting Zionism, who are so devoted to the cause of liberating Palestine from colonization, though Zionism has vastly more resources, that they're willing to accept death. I don't think there's much of a parallel to be made between al-Hashashiyin and the Palestinian freedom fighters, but it does bring up that people have somewhat made this connection in a way which makes you stop and go yikes. But what do I mean by this? The main source text for Assassin's Creed, according to creative director Patrice Delisle, is a novel called Alamut by Slovenian author Vladimir Bartol. Published in 1938 in Slovenian, it wasn't until 1988 that it was published in French, and 2003 when it was published in English. Delisle may very well have read it in French, as he's French, but both translations lead us to a similar issue, which is, as Mert Kommel points out in his study of Orientalism in Assassin's Creed, we can trace two important milestones that defined the imagery of the Arabo-Islamic other in general, and the assassins in particular in contemporary Western popular thought. The first was the late 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran, while the second and more vivid one, the 9/11/2001 terrorist attack on US soil. Despite the intellectual effort of the few, many did not read learned studies but rather such novels as Bartol's Alamut, in 1988 translated into French and rapidly gaining immense popularity, which was editorially promoted as faithful historical account on the allegedly fundamentalistic religious struggles of the 11th century Persia, thus linking the old sect of Nizari Ismailis with the modern phenomenon of Islamic fundamentalism, and once again anachronistic transpositions of the medieval assassination techniques into modern terrorism were made, scholarly writings not excluded. Bernard Lewis, for example, devoted the entire final chapter of his renowned book to the demonstration of the thesis that the assassins invented terrorism, as he puts it. Yikes. So the historical sect, al-Batiniya, were very much associated with Islamic fundamentalism in the early 2000s and even the 1980s, though such a connection is both ahistorical and apolitical in the extreme. Palestinians aren't specifically mentioned here, but we all know that Palestinian freedom fighters are painted with a broad racist stroke as terrorists, so unfortunately this applies. But Assassin's Creed obscures the religious motivations of al-Batiniya, which is fundamental to the history of the sect. Instead, the assassins are a group without religious or political affiliation, fervently devoted to freedom in the abstract, with no apparent ideology or manifesto regarding what freedom is or how to achieve it. The assassins certainly don't seem to see the Franks as colonizers, and this lack of political analysis certainly leaves an enormous dent in their mission for freedom. All the assassins do is seek to eliminate their rival sect, the Templars, who are also based on a group which really did exist. But who were they? The Knights Templar were a religious military order of Franks who policed the Frankish states from their great military forts, who came up earlier because of their involvement in a plot to desecrate Muslim holy sites. The Templars of Assassin's Creed are also divested of their religious or political motivations, dedicated abstractly to order. At least their aims are clearer than the Assassins. The Templars believe that establishing dictatorial control of the globe, even mass mind control of the world's population, is the path to peace. While the Assassins are defined simply in opposition to that, our goal only ever seems to be stopping the Templars of the Assassin's Creed universe certainly reek of fascism. In fact, in Assassin's Creed Mirage, the Order, which is the name of the Templars that Ubisoft had to retroactively come up with after starting to make games set before 1191, are described as supremacists. Subtext, white. Subtext, the ruling class. It's prominent in several games. In Assassin's Creed 2, the assassins fight for the freedom to socially climb, and the Templars fight to shore up the hereditary control of European nobility, though our protagonist is more invested in his personal revenge than any of that. In Assassin's Creed 3, the assassins fight for American independence from Britain, who are allied with the Templars, and protagonist Radon Hagedon goes along with it in hopes of protecting his people, the indigenous Genian Gahaka. Too late, he finds out that the American colonists were never interested in the liberation of indigenous people. Across the franchise, the Templar Order very clearly demonstrates colonial ideologies. They are the worthy and will bring peace to the world by saving, read dominating, the unworthy. But the Templars in the game aren't just Franks, they're also Arabs. In fact, they're mostly Arabs. The fervor of both sects feels like the religious or political devotion of their real-life counterparts, but textually it actually isn't. So somehow Assassin's Creed gets to have its cake and eat it too. On one hand, it reinforces the religious conflict frame in thinking about modern Palestinian history. The idea that this is just the latest version of an ancient religious conflict, both sides are just as bad as each other, etc., which obscures the colonial power dynamic. On the other hand, religion is not actually what divides, nor is ethnicity what divides. Therefore, this can hardly even be a political conflict, let alone a conflict between colonizer and colonized. This obscuring effect is actually achieved by the fact that the Assassins and the Templars stand in for Muslims and Christians without either being Muslim or Christian, and with the Templar side including Arabs in their ranks. Worse, the game insists on questioning whether the Templars are all that bad really, and whether the Assassins and the Templars don't actually have some things in common. As I've argued, the Crusades should probably be thought of as concerning Muslim majority but all indigenous people of the region on one side, and a force of colonizing Catholic Frankish invaders and settlers on the other side. All the while, as religion tries to make itself invisible in the narrative of Assassin's Creed, it's inescapable in the call to prayer of Damascus, the churches, synagogues, and mosques of Jerusalem, the crucifix that adorns the Frankish armor, and the occupied city of Akka. In The Problem of Memory in Assassin's Creed, Robson Scarasati Bello writes that the disclaimer included before the start menu, that inspired by historical events and characters, this work of fiction was designed, developed, and produced by a multicultural team of various religious faiths and beliefs, is relevant here. Assassin's Creed artist Kai Nguyen claims that the producers took care not to paint the Crusades in black and white, that is, to associate the Assassins and Templars with the religious paths of each order. Jean Goosen also says that defining targets by their alliance with the Templars rather than their political position in the conflict was intentional. Bello writes, "The Assassin's motto, 'Nothing is true, everything is permitted,' is a defining philosophy repeated throughout the series. It emphasizes that the Assassins' skepticism towards nationalism, religion, and other beliefs, and their belief that there is no singular truth. The series' statement thus combines cultural pluralism with a healthy dose of skepticism." The different protagonists, settings, and time periods presented in the series reflect a liberal, progressive, and Eurocentric view of history. The Assassins are quote-unquote enlightened, and their values mimic much of our own time liberalism rather than historic morals. This can be seen in many games in the treatment of the quote-unquote other. However, other cultures are presented through their customs, clothings, architecture, and languages, but without their internal contradictions. The assassin protagonist is a modern man whose historic culture has little or no influence on him. Bello also critiques the game's view of history by pointing out that the premise of the game emphasizes that the animus means you can see history as it really happened. The team behind the game believes that the obstacles to creating an accurate historical reconstruction are merely subjective, based on choice, or technical, due to technological limitations. They imply that it's possible to reconstruct the past as it was. The pursuit of realism over fantasy is not seen as a series of choices regarding reimagining the past, but rather as limitation caused by artistic or technological factors, under the assumption that if we had access to the past with an animus, for example, we would have access to objective reality. In this way, Assassin's Creed presents itself as quote-unquote accurate and historically neutral, which in itself is a highly biased and historically and politically specific position. Bello concludes, by representing multiple perspectives on history, these narratives create a sense of continuity between past and present, projecting current values onto past events. Through the game's virtual environments, players can experience and engage with this collective memory on a global scale, transcending local community memory. I emphasize this because the purported objective memory of Assassin's Creed, which is actually a construction of the Holy Land through a very specific collective memory, the collective memory of the West, transplants the community memory of Palestine and Palestinians. On one hand, the obscuring of religious motivations and contexts actually goes some way, Mert Kommel would argue, to what makes Assassin's Creed stand out in the year 2007 as a text which doesn't necessarily represent Arabs as terrorists you shoot at. At the same time, it's troubling. The Arab has to be westernized, neutralized, devoid of context in order to be palatable to the Western audience, in order to avoid racist tropes. Altair even has an American accent. The white supremacist idea of universalism, positioning oneself as unbiased or neutral, is exercising an idea of oneself as superior for having transcended humanity. Lesser beings are sullied by bias, higher beings are free of it. Of course, the benefit of such an ideology for white supremacy is that it always places the white subject in the neutral position, and the racialized subject in the non-neutral position. We're always biased and flawed, derided for having emotions and opinions, particularly on subjects which I think should require, on a moral and spiritual level, some kind of response. Like genocide bad. The universal subject of Assassin's Creed is above taking sides, and each side is vapid precisely for being a side, a position which is awfully convenient in that it supports the status quo, therefore by default supporting a side, the side of the oppressor. If nothing is true and everything is permitted, then Palestinian material realities of occupation and colonization from the Crusades to today are not true, and this very colonization is permitted. Such a laissez-faire philosophy leads us to question without aim, to break rules for the sake of breaking them. No wonder the assassins are never able to achieve freedom. But while Assassin's Creed would try to convince us that it's above sides, the game clearly takes a more sympathizing and humanizing view towards Europeans than Arabs in various tacit ways. For example, the two key historical figures referred to in the game are Richard I and Salah ad-Din. In the game that would begin one of the franchise's major tropes, the famous historical figure cameo, Assassin's Creed gives us a significant moment of interaction with King Richard I of England, someone I couldn't care less about. But today, amongst Arabs, Salah ad-Din is easily considered one of the most important medieval historical figures there is, and we never get to see him in the game. To say I was disappointed is putting it mildly. Despite Assassin's Creed purporting to present us with grand philosophical themes, how do we end violence? How do we destroy violent systems? What is freedom, really? The delivery falls flat because of a fundamentally liberal white supremacist worldview that is incapable of answering or providing solutions to these questions, only able to reinforce the status quo. Part of the issue here, which is an issue with the franchise at large, is that it brings up the issue of freedom versus control in a depoliticized way, and its overall narrative framing device that the Assassins and Templars fight eternally for control of pieces of Eden, artifacts which allow mass mind control and unspeakable power, is part of the problem. If a MacGuffin, like a piece of Eden, is responsible for all abuse of power in the world, then we don't look to things like institutional structures, how propaganda manufactures consent for genocide, our own role in consenting to the status quo, and our own complicity in the institution. Such a conspiracy narrative lends itself better, I suppose, to a player power fantasy about ruling the world or saving it than it does to bringing us meaningfully closer to collective liberation. This probably suits the franchise just fine, as a circular problem with no solution means endless potential for future installments and endless profits for Ubisoft. This whole discussion brings into focus something really important to consider: historical research. Like all research, it has ethical and political implications. In this particular context, researching the Crusades today in 2024 means research involving historical sites. Many of these are now occupied by the settler colony of Israel. The historic Palestinian city of Akka, for example, is occupied by Israel. Arsuf, depicted in the game briefly, is also occupied by Israel. Al-Quds is not supposed to be owned by any nation state, but the Israeli occupation forces have boots on the ground across that city that police, terrorize, and massacre Palestinians regularly, particularly during religious holidays in one of the holiest places in the world to Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Many on-site researchers are Israeli settlers working for Israeli universities. Noor Masalha writes at length in his book A 4,000-Year History of Palestine about how Israeli academic institutions are factories for false narratives about the history of Palestine, which justify the settler colonial project of Israel, which treat the Bible uncritically as purely historical text and aim to prove entitlement to the land. In our indigeneity video, we talked about settler moves to innocence as theorized by indigenous scholars Tuck and Yang, and how some of these are about the settler proving that they're more native than the native. We can absolutely see this at play in the Zionist project and Israeli academic institutions by playing a key role in creating these false narratives which justify genocide and settler colonialism, are therefore not neutral. So engaging with them is not a neutral choice. This is something that Palestinians and their allies are more than aware of. The BDS movement has specifically called for an academic boycott of Israel, which means a refusal to engage with Israeli academic institutions. If you're researching the Crusades, you're faced with this choice, period. Of course, this is something that came up through the historical research I did about the game. The Crusades, a BBC documentary narrated by Dr. Thomas Asbridge of Queen Mary University of London, uncritically refers to Israel when depicting contemporary archaeological sites. That might seem innocuous, but in fact it's incredibly violent in its contribution to the normalization of Israel. He was also the historical consultant for Kingdom of Heaven, a film which is certainly notable for its vapid political viewpoint and ends on the vacuous note, "Peace in the Kingdom of Heaven still feels elusive." Why is it elusive, Jan? Maybe because the colonizers keep colonizing? On the subject of movement, in the case of this documentary, you can see that this white British man is traveling freely across occupied Palestine, and he probably did that by traveling through Tel Aviv. So this also really highlights the fact that by refusing to engage in Israeli academic boycotts, you're really just metaphorically spitting in the face of Palestinians who are unable to live freely, move freely, or return freely to their homelands. And of course, the BBC is an organisation which at this point should be infamous for its unabashed imperialist propagandizing, especially as since October it's had to admit to unethical and inaccurate journalism regarding the genocide in Gaza. Meanwhile, the Al Jazeera documentary The Crusades, an Arab Perspective doesn't only provide a wildly different point of view, which it's self-conscious of doing in its title and content, it also presents a different set of historical research practices. This documentary comes from a network which reports in both English and Arabic language and reaches different audiences for this reason. The documentary is narrated in English, but with significant portions delivered by various academics speaking in Arabic and subtitled in English. The documentary is aware that the dominant English language narratives about the Crusades are highly romanticized and even, where critical, err on the side of supporting white supremacist hegemony. For example, Dr. Asbridge was essentially intent on the framing that both sides were as bad as each other, that it doesn't quite make sense to consider the Crusades an example of early or proto-settler colonialism, because we today simply can't understand the collective religious delusion experienced both by the Frankish Crusaders and the Muslim armies that repelled them. This narrative is awfully convenient for a lot of reasons, not least of which is that it dangerously feeds into the modern narrative that the situation in Palestine is just an ancient religious conflict, a narrative which obscures the power dynamic at play, and the fact that Zionism is a distinctly modern political movement rooted in European colonialism. The Crusades, an Arab Perspective, aims to intervene by providing an Arab perspective. It's inspired by the book that I mentioned earlier, published in 1983, The Crusades Through Arab Eyes, which essentially centers primary sources in the Arabic language, turning the Crusades from a story about valiant, righteous Christian heroes journeying to rescue the land from savage Muslims into a narrative about a region fragmented by political disputes, watching in horror as a horde of fair-haired and blue-eyed zealots descend upon their land with terrifying strength, religious fervor, and racist bloodlust. The Arabs, of course, are no perfect victims and are not infallible in all this. We are shockingly, at the end of it all, human. But the emphasis in these perspectives that I absolutely agree with is that it's ridiculous to say that both sides are as bad as each other, when one side is an invading army with an explicitly racist colonizing project in mind, and the other is trying to protect their homes from this force. In fact, many indigenous people at the time were frustrated with the inactivity of their leaders, who they felt allowed this to happen in order to preserve their wealth and control under the Franks, and this is part of why someone like Salah ad-Din is viewed as a hero. The Al Jazeera documentary explicitly makes the connection between the Frankish Crusaders and modern Zionists, a connection which I think has some merit. Of course, that's a big part of why I'm making this video, and it's worth tackling head-on rather than tiptoeing around it, like the BBC documentary. Finally, it uses the expertise of historians from French and English institutions like the Sorbonne and Oxford, as well as various Arabic-speaking countries, which crucially include the Islamic University and Al-Azhar University, both of which had campuses in Gaza as well as Cairo, but these Gaza campuses, along with every other university in Gaza, have now been destroyed utterly by Israel as part of its project of cultural as well as wholesale genocide. Now, the creation of Assassin's Creed, as is true for most works of historical fiction, requires historical research. Therefore, historical research ethics must be interrogated in the creation of it as a historical fiction game. How did the team navigate these ethical quandaries? Did they work with Israeli institutions, or did they adhere to the call for an academic boycott from BDS? Assassin's Creed prides itself on its work with historians, or it has done since Assassin's Creed 2, which began to focus on this as an issue of priority. Assassin's Creed 2 introduced a database feature which allows you to read about the history of people and locations throughout the game, a feature which developed with the franchise as Ubisoft recognized that Assassin's Creed was starting to be used in history classrooms. Assassin's Creed 3 saw Maxime Durand being brought in as an in-house historian, and the franchise continues to work with various consultants and academics, so the rest is history. It's interesting to note that the franchise didn't necessarily make the distinction between fictional and historical codex entries in Assassin's Creed 2, and it doesn't necessarily do so in its latest installment, Mirage, either. It's also worth noting that the sudden interest in historicity seems connected to the fact that the vast majority of games from Assassin's Creed 2 onwards are set in Europe and in the West. Brotherhood and Revelations in Italy, Assassin's Creed 3 in the USA, Unity in France, Syndicate in England, Valhalla in Europe, Odyssey in Greece. The exceptions are the first Assassin's Creed, Palestine and Syria, Black Flag, the West Indies, Origins, Egypt, and Mirage, Iraq and Iran. If Assassin's Creed is being taken as objective historic reality, which is what it presents itself as, then its use in history classrooms can be a problem if taken uncritically. But Nicolas Trepanier writes that Assassin's Creed can be a very engaging tool for getting students to think critically and ask the right questions about historical sources and the presentation of history. And I totally agree, because that's what we're doing here. But what information is actually available about the research ethics and considerations and practices of Ubisoft itself, and any external historians they employ? Not a whole lot, certainly not as regards the first game. In an interview from 2018, the core dev team of the first game talks about doing some of their own historical research and leaning heavily on the fictional book Alamut, which we mentioned. It's worth noting that in spite of Assassin's Creed's opening disclaimer, which would give one the impression of a diverse development team, its core team is actually comprised mostly of white men and the occasional white woman. In this case, crucially, creative director Patrice Delisset and scriptwriter Corey May are white French and white American, respectively, and the two historical consultants on the project, Dr. Paul Cobb and Dr. David Nicole, are white American and British professors of medieval Islamic history. Assassin's Creed Mirage, a self-professed love letter to the original Assassin's Creed, is highly relevant because it does make reference to Palestine in one blink or you'll miss it moment. This is because it's set in modern Iraq and Iran, during the 9th century Abbasid Khalifa, which Palestine was a part of. Remember, the province of Palestine, and Baghdad was the capital of. In Mirage, there are historical side codex entries which you can collect through the world, which include text and images that teach you about Abbasid history. Most of the images in these entries are sourced from personal collections and from European and US museums like the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the Louvre in Paris, which leaves us asking why so many of these historical artifacts are stolen and held under lock and key in the West. I'll give you a clue: colonization. Importantly, we have one historical site which claims that Khirbat el-Majfar's Hammam was located in Jericho in the 8th century, which is in the modern state of Palestine. And another shows a reed mat from 10th century Tiberias, which it claims is located in present-day Israel. This is a stark case of tiptoeing around the issue. While on one hand there's an acknowledgement of the existence of Palestine, which is not insignificant, there's also a normalization of the settler colony of Israel. This speaks to the wider franchise's liberal sensibility, and it attempts to appeal to all sides for marketability. It enshrines a two-state solution mentality, which I'll problematize more later, but for now I'll note that even if it were desirable, it's been made impossible by Israel's increased expansion into Palestinian land beyond the initial borders of 1947. It's certainly nowhere close to calling for land back for indigenous Palestinians, and as we've discussed, a politically neutral statement falls on the side of the oppressor. I was also taken completely by surprise that the credits of this game had several Ukraine flags on them. We don't have tons of time to unpack this, but there is the blatant hypocrisy. A lot of people have pointed to this, that it's hypocritical to support armed resistance of Ukrainians to their invaders, but not armed resistance of Palestinians to their occupiers. But something that often gets left out of the conversation is that the Ukrainian government is a fascist government that does support Zionism. So in a sense, the Ukraine flag is a really fraught symbol, and in a sense, it's maybe not hypocritical, maybe it's consistent. Mirage brings a level of richness and education about the contemporary Islamic period that is sadly very much lacking from the first Assassin's Creed game, though Mirage is absolutely not without fault either, unfortunately possibly the destiny of this franchise and its format. Sania Ahmed's critique of Mirage hits more or less perfectly for me. The game does a disservice to its setting by refusing to offer character depth or narrative nuance, which is a shame considering the effort gone into recreating the world of 9th century Abbasid Baghdad. Unfortunately, it is mostly just a pretty facade, and while Mirage succeeds in a lot of the places that the original Assassin's Creed fails, it also fails in a lot of the places the original Assassin's Creed fails. The first Assassin's Creed game was made before any infrastructure was set up at Ubisoft to hold historical realism, understood as creating the impression of being realistic as a core part of its franchise identity. It's clear to me both in developer interviews and in the development history of Assassin's Creed that this is partly because Palestine and Syria are in a sense not viewed as historic locations, but as fantastical locations. I think the hangover from the original goal to create a Prince of Persia game, as well as a reliance on fiction and a prioritization of feel, look, and operation on the new gen of consoles, relegated historical setting to an afterthought, something in service of the rest. And, well, there's the racism. There's a case to be made for this mentality permeating the rest of the franchise as well, but it's hard not to wonder if they could get away with it so egregiously in the first game, partly because Westerners don't really see the Holy Land as a real place, but as a mythical paradise of milk and honey. As Pope Urban II spoke of, a land of myth and legend, where indigenous people have never lived, a land for a people without a land, ripe for the taking and ready to be colonized. Now, having discussed the setting and the context in depth, let's turn to how we move through it in Assassin's Creed. Movement is more or less a necessary part of every video game. Whatever the game, whatever the genre, whatever the era, you, the person sitting behind your computer or on your couch with a controller in hand, are always moving. You're moving your hands, your fingers, sometimes your entire body gets pulled into the movement, maybe during an intense boss fight or QuickTime event sequence. And then, of course, you're looking, listening. Of course, everyone's physical experience of play is different, especially according to our abilities and disabilities, but I think it's still true that there's almost always a physical embodied experience that you as a player are having when you play. This embodied experience can be what connects you so viscerally to your virtual avatar, which you navigate through virtual space with a click of your mouse or a push of an analog stick. Whether that avatar is human or non-human, whatever that space may be, and however you may move through it, perhaps this embodied connection we have with the avatar is what makes it feel so frustrating when your movement has limitations. Maybe you're playing an old Tomb Raider game, or even better, Barbie Explorer, and you find that if you don't angle your jump just right, you won't be able to make it. Maybe there's an invisible wall or something it doesn't make any sense not to be able to climb or even step over. When your virtual avatar can't move, when their movement is restricted, it's frustrating. It's like you can't move. So you have to try again and again and again, or maybe you have to get creative, or maybe you have to brute force your way through it. Or maybe there's simply no solution, because there isn't one coded into the game. So, let's talk about how we move in Assassin's Creed. Assassin's Creed has a fairly rigid narrative structure which structures the way you move in the game. When the story begins, Altair is already a master assassin, but he kills an old man who didn't need to die for the assassins to achieve their mission, which is violating the first tenet of the titular creed. Soon after, his violation of all three tenets, including hide in plain sight and never compromise the Brotherhood, lead to the opening mission's catastrophic failure. We are taken to Masyaf in modern-day Syria, where the assassin's fortress lies, and as a result of Altair's actions, we have to fend off an assault led by Robert de Sable on the fortress. As punishment, Altair's master, Al-Muallim, this means the teacher in Arabic, strips Altair of his rank and gives him a mission. Altair is given a list of 9 names, 9 assassinations he must undertake, and with each he regains a rank until he can earn back his place as master assassin. These 9 assassinations are split into groups of 3. Phase 1 contains 1 target in Jerusalem, 1 in Damascus, and 1 in Akka. Phase 2 contains 1 in Jerusalem, 1 in Damascus, and 1 in Akka. And Phase 3, surprise surprise, contains 1 in Jerusalem, 1 in Damascus, and 1 in Akka. You can do these in any order within each phase, but ultimately it's the same cycle which takes up the majority of the game. So the vast majority of the game is dedicated to these 3 cities: the landlocked Palestinian city of Al-Quds or Jerusalem, the northern coastal Palestinian city of Akka, and the Syrian city of Damascus. Each city is split into 3 districts, a poor, middle, and rich district. Within each of the 3 phases of the game, you unlock each district one by one, and in the meantime, if you try to walk into a district before it's been unlocked, you face a memory restriction, which will disappear as the game progresses. This is a clever piece of narrative logic provided by Assassin's Creed's premise that you are actually a modern-day man, Desmond Miles, using a technological innovation called the Animus to access the memory of your ancestor through your DNA. But this is essentially a classic unlock a new area as you progress piece of game design. And unlocking new areas as you progress also generates a sense of a reward, a sense that freedom of movement or access to space is meant to be earned, which, to be clear, may be in a game, but certainly not in real life. Unfortunately, this feels necessary to say because our world does enforce this idea with its system of borders. It perpetuates the idea that there are those who are deserving and those who are undeserving of the freedom to move. All this was before the mainstream industry became obsessed with creating endlessly open worlds with as few restrictions as possible and as much freedom of movement as possible. If you contrast Assassin's Creed with future franchise installments, its immediate successor, Assassin's Creed 2, in some ways has a similar structure focused on navigating a couple of specific cities and small towns, but where your movement is restricted by these memory walls, the game design mostly hides it away cleverly, so that you don't feel as restricted. For example, in the first part of the game, you can move freely through more or less the whole city of Florence, or the whole city as far as you can tell. You don't encounter these stark memory walls as often, and when you do, it doesn't feel quite as restrictive. Future games would do away with this more or less entirely, especially as games become more and more open, taking us to the post-Origins paradigm where the future of Assassin's Creed seems more or less locked into the open-world RPG maximal freedom format. Ubisoft isn't the only AAA studio that's gone in that direction. But returning to the first Assassin's Creed, these memory restrictions are really starkly visually represented as a wall which you can't move through. In other games, I think if you cross it, you become desynchronized, meaning the person in the Animus becomes desynchronized with their ancestor because the memory doesn't line up with the way they're moving within the memory. This is actually something really interesting to consider, which is never really confronted within the Assassin's Creed universe. That is, what it means, especially in these earlier, more linear installments, but even in the later ones, that the person in the Animus is meant to synchronize with their ancestor by behaving and moving like them, therefore matching the memory. For example, in later installments, you don't just become desynchronized if you die when the ancestor isn't yet meant to die. You become desynchronized if you insist on violating the creed or if you fail at something you're not meant to fail at. This all implies that the person in the Animus isn't simply watching a memory but moving through it, just like a video game player navigating a virtual world through an avatar. But they have to move through it correctly to follow a script, otherwise they won't be allowed to move through it at all. Earlier, I bounced off Bello's argument to talk about how Assassin's Creed enforces the hegemonic collective memory of Western imperialism while erasing indigenous Palestinian memory. The desynchronization paradigm totally reinforces the idea that Assassin's Creed's script is the correct historical script, which erases indigenous Palestinian historical scripts and sidelines the potential for exploring pluralities of histories and perspectives in an interesting, nuanced, or critical way. Interestingly, later in the franchise this is attempted. I break it down further in my analysis of Assassin's Creed 3 in our indigeneity video, but in short, Assassin's Creed 3 actually does have a DLC which depicts an alternative history, as opposed to the main plot of Assassin's Creed 3, which itself is an alternative history, but they wouldn't want you to think of it that way. Unfortunately, potentially as expected, a little spoiler is that, as Adrienne Shaw writes, it ultimately falls back into Assassin's Creed's insistence on fatalism and the normalization of white supremacist structures. Memory restrictions aren't the only restrictions you experience on your movement in the game. There are military restrictions, for example at Al-Aqsa Mosque compound or at William of Montferrat's fort, which you have to think about how to overcome, usually by climbing or blending into the crowd. Equally, the entire city is crawling with guards who, if they spot you doing something illegal, will chase you down and try to kill you. In this sense, the city ends up feeling like a quite policed and militarized space. But who's imposing these military restrictions and why? Having some sort of military restriction and combat is classic in a video game like this. Again, they're trying to design challenge and reward into the game. But the socio-political or historical context of why these cities feel so policed, and whether this is reflective of the time or primarily an exercise in gameplay design, is unclear. The game tries to even it out, as we discussed in part 1. To try to make the Arabs and the Franks, and by extension the Assassins and the Templars, no better or worse than one another. But ultimately you are being policed by Arabs and killed by Arabs disproportionately. Because of the 3 cities in 1191, only Akka was occupied by the Franks. It's one of those touches which, like the King Richard thing, feels skewed towards a more sympathetic view of Europeans, or at least a decontextualized one that doesn't portray them as a colonizing force at all. I've just been talking about the 3 cities almost as though they were one, and this is because functionally in Assassin's Creed they may as well be. Navigating these 3 city spaces is mechanically very similar, and a lot of the gameplay is very repetitive. In order to reach your assassination target, you have to do a little investigation, which encourages you to explore the city. Climbing and synchronizing with viewpoints unfogs the map, then you can eavesdrop on conversations, intimidate public speakers, or pickpocket evidence. Tasks like these will give you information about where your target will be and how and when you might strike them. There's a minimum amount you need to progress, but the more you collect, the more you can plan out your assassination in creative and sneaky ways. Honestly, I love this, but what I think is missing, which Sania Ahmed also argues regarding Mirage, is an opportunity to do more environmental storytelling about the person we're assassinating, about the city we're moving through. A codex entry feels like a bit of a cheap substitute, and in the first Assassin's Creed there aren't even codex entries. Who these people are, what their motivations are, why we should care about them or not before we take their lives is simply not fleshed out enough. These issues are somewhat clumsily relegated to 1 or 2 cutscenes before the moment of death. Granted, these cutscenes are often quite memorable and powerful, and the target's final confession as the life drains from their eyes. I think this is such a shame because given the historical context of Assassin's Creed, if instead of doing this grand plot about the eternal conflict between the Assassins and the Templars, if you focused in on the historical setting and you told a story about the Assassin sect and their original intentions and how this interacted with the colonizing, invading force and created tensions with fellow Muslims who were experiencing colonization, then you have a really powerful and interesting and nuanced story. But unfortunately, we just don't get that. Outside of the main gameplay, there isn't much in the way of side quests, which would flesh out the world further. There are loads of these save citizen events where you kill some guards and someone says, "I wish my son was half as brave as you." These events are interesting to pause on in the sense that they portray city guards, cops really, as bullies and create allies with common folk who will help you if you're running from the guards by standing in the way or fighting them. But again, it lacks depth, which is why instead of a nuanced critique of Ayyubid rule during the Frankish Crusades, it feels like an orientalist caricature. And it becomes extremely repetitive. Even the main gameplay, though I really like it, gets repetitive after a while. Some variation and more character and narrative depth probably would have made it feel a lot less so. I do want to give credit where credit's due in that this game still accomplished some really incredible things at the time it was made. And for all its faults, to this day I think it really has something special, which is why I often find myself coming back to and thinking about it, as opposed to Assassin's Creed 2. This is a vastly smoother game in many ways, and the gameplay is designed cleverly to feel more varied, but it just doesn't hit the same for me. I can't bring myself to care about the story, characters, or setting in Assassin's Creed 2 at all. Yes, I'll say it because men need to hear it. Ezio isn't just misogynistic, he's boring. Boring! The repetitiveness of the first Assassin's Creed has been critiqued from a gameplay experience before, and to be honest, it's a problem with some of the other titles, and one which can be linked to resource restrictions and the grueling, crunching, factory-level output expected of AAA workers. The developers of Assassin's Creed mostly laugh off working ridiculous hours and drinking regularly to get through it, but this isn't a good state of affairs. We need to unionize game workers. I have no doubt the things about Assassin's Creed which I love, but always fall short of their potential, are connected to the market's obsession with, well, marketability, and with churning out new, near-identical products as fast as possible. But I do want to point to the effect of this repetitiveness in the context of the representation of historic Palestine and Syria, and the indigenous Arabs who live there. On a symbolic level, the effect is flattening. Al-Quds, Akka, and Damascus are functionally the same city in-game. The 3-district design isn't at all reflective of what these cities were or are actually like, especially when we consider a city like Jerusalem, which has an incredibly rich and diverse history, full of different ethnic and religious communities. This is important to note because Jerusalem, and in fact all of Palestine's religious and ethnic diversity, is a unique and wonderful feature of its history, and it's one which is under attack by Zionist settler colonization, precisely because the project of creating a Jewish ethno-state is the project of having an exclusive society, where minority groups will never have the same rights as Israeli Jews, because the ultimate goal is to kill them or get them to leave in order to obtain an exclusively Jewish society. Visually, Jerusalem and Damascus are extremely similar, with their sandy colour and tall minarets, with colourfully clad Arabs walking the streets. Of course, there's the notable exception of the unmistakable Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, but meanwhile, European-occupied Akka is grey and miserable, full of white people in drab colours and European-style architecture at every turn. I find this quite funny, actually, but almost comic in its starkness. And something similarly worth noting is that ancillary representations of the first Assassin's Creed game, from the gameplay trailer to its promotional images to its brief return in Assassin's Creed 2, almost exclusively used the European visuals of Akka, not the Orientalist visuals of Damascus or Jerusalem. It reminds me of the marketing for Assassin's Creed 3, which insists on using the name Connor instead of the Genyen Gahaga name Radon Hageron for its indigenous protagonist. Whatever the reason, which we've described as resource restriction because of the era of gaming, as well as crunch and the capitalist forces that exert themselves on creative industries, the effect is ultimately a racist one, especially when this game is completely lacking in the ambient historical information, even through a codex or database which tells you about the cities, their cultures, the way people lived and related to one another. The effect is a flat Oriental backdrop to a story of political and philosophical intrigue. As I've argued before, it ends up feeling like Palestine and indeed Syria are simply the fantastical Holy Land, not real material places where real human universes walk and collide every moment of every day. Even if my critiques of Assassin's Creed's assassination sequences hold largely true of Mirage, the way Mirage builds the city of Baghdad via the historical sites features and some smaller interactions make it feel much more alive than the Palestine of Assassin's Creed. With all of this in mind, how does virtual movement through historic Palestine in Assassin's Creed compare to Palestinian freedom to move today? I've talked about how you, as the player controlling a virtual avatar, move through the virtual space of historic Palestine, how that space is constructed and what the restrictions on your movement are within that space, and some of the symbolic effects created. But this is significant precisely because freedom of movement is something which is severely restricted for Palestinians today in the material world. So what restrictions do Palestinians face, and why is Israel so concerned with suffocating their freedom of movement? I'll put resources in the description below, but I'm just going to give you a quick rundown on the relevant history to kind of create a sense of the geographic space that we're talking about and moving through that geographic space. In the late 1800s, the Zionist movement arose, committed to creating a Jewish ethno-state through the colonization of Palestine. By 1917, they got British Foreign Secretary Lord Arthur Balfour to promise the land of historic Palestine to them for colonization. The British took control of what was called the British Mandate of Palestine in 1918 after winning World War I and taking it from the Ottoman Empire. For 3 decades, the British funded Zionist militias and institutions and suppressed Palestinian resistance to colonization to lay the groundwork for the establishment of the settler colony of Israel. In 1947, after World War II, the UN created this partition plan which proposed to segment historic Palestine into 2 states, a state of Palestine and a state of Israel. The thing is, partitioning this land meant that indigenous Palestinians living in these blue areas would be massacred or forcibly displaced from their ancestral homelands. In other words, this plan legitimized settler colonialism and genocide either way by signing off on the creation of a state of Israel on top of Palestinian land without the consent of Palestinians. One of the issues with this plan, which was very intentional and very strategic, is that it geographically fragmented Palestinians into these disconnected areas, and Israel hoarded fertile land space and important seaports. But between 1947 and 1949, as Zionist militias, which would go on to form the IOF, carried out the genocide of Palestinians in order to create their nation state, they took even more land than what was promised to them in the UN partition plan. This included encroaching further on Gaza, and it included occupying Akka, which was originally meant to be part of a sovereign Palestinian state. Then, in 1967, Israel invaded the parts that were meant to be an autonomous Palestinian state, that's East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza Strip, and placed them under military occupation. They didn't stop there either, they also occupied the Egyptian Sinai, which Egypt retook in 1982, and the Syrian Golan Heights, which are still occupied today by Israel. And that's more or less where we're at today, except Israel is now committing another genocide in the Gaza Strip so they can build settlements there as well, because clearly their policy is to expand and colonize as much of the region as possible. With this backdrop in mind, I kind of want to take the opportunity to focus in on the locations depicted in Assassin's Creed, locations that you might have virtually navigated in the game. And I want to talk about what these indigenous cities are experiencing now and how the indigenous people of these places are able to move. Masyaf and Damascus are in modern-day Syria, which is north of the Golan Heights that I mentioned are occupied by Israel today, though with Israel's expansionist and genocidal policies in mind, and the fact that even a small part of Syria is occupied by them, we should consider Syria to absolutely be threatened by Israel. Focusing in on the Palestinian locations of El-Quds, Akka, and Arsuf, let's start by honing in on Jerusalem. Khalil Tafakji of the Arab Studies Society in Jerusalem tells Al-Majdal, the quarterly magazine of the Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights, tells us, before 1948, Jerusalem was a major hub of Palestinian social, spiritual, economic, and cultural life, second only to Jaffa. It was also the headquarters for many of the Palestinian political forces which, to varying degrees, had mobilized to defend Palestine from the violent Zionist takeover. The military wings of these organizations set up their military front in the villages to the west of the city in an effort to halt the Zionist forces before they reached the city, and in the early months were somewhat successful despite their very poor training and lack of arms. On the 6th of April 1948, the Haganah, the main Zionist military force, launched Operation Naksun to push towards Jerusalem. 3 days later, the Irgun and Stern committed the infamous Deir Yassin massacre as part of the operation, and the following day, the main Palestinian resistance force led by Abdul Qadir al-Husseini was defeated at Al-Qasta. By early May, the British forces essentially handed over the western part of the city to the Haganah, and the Jordanian military held onto the walled old city and the eastern part. The 23,000 Palestinian residents of the western part of the city became refugees, many of them in Shafat and Qalandia refugee camps on the outskirts of the city, and others went to Jordan and elsewhere. In terms of land and property, practically the whole western part of Jerusalem was confiscated by the absentee property law. As for the tens of Palestinian villages to the west of Jerusalem, all were depopulated and destroyed, with the exception of Abu Ghosh, Ain Naquba, and Ain Rafa. I'm sure you can already understand why so many Palestinians make parallels between the Zionist occupation of Jerusalem and the Frankish one that we talked about earlier, as well as why they look to the memory of Salah ad-Din's liberation of Jerusalem with hope. So Western Jerusalem was occupied by the settler colony of Israel in 1948. The eastern part then came under Jordanian control until Israel put it under military occupation in 1967. Khalil Tafakji continues, the days in which the Israeli forces entered the city and established control were themselves quite significant. I was 17 at the time and remember the buses that the Israelis brought to Bab el-Zahra, Herod's Gate, right in front of Al-Rushaydiyya school, on which they loaded Palestinians and bused them to the Jordanian border. This was in addition to many who fled the intense bombing and fighting that took place during the war. Around 30,000 of the 100,000 Palestinians in the eastern part of Jerusalem became refugees during and just after the Israeli occupation. Another very important event was the destruction of Haret al-Maghariba, the Moroccan quarter, just southwest of the Aqsa Mosque inside and its extension outside of the old city walls. The part of the city wall separating the two parts of the neighborhood is the Wailing Wall, a very important religious site for adherents of Judaism. Historically, this neighborhood is where Moroccan immigrants to Jerusalem and their descendants lived for most of the past 7 or 8 centuries, and the Ayyubid, Mamluk, and Ottoman architecture of the neighborhood was quite distinct from the rest of the old city. The destruction order was issued by the military commander Shlomo Lahat, who was previously the mayor of Tel Aviv. And on the 11th of June 1967, the bulldozers began to demolish the homes within the old city near the wall. And over several days, most of the neighborhood on both sides of the wall was flattened. Many of the neighborhood residents refused to leave, and their homes were destroyed while they were inside, which meant that many of them were killed. Today, when people go to pray at the Wailing Wall, they're standing on the site where these people's homes once stood, and where many of them were killed. 132 Palestinian families were forcibly displaced from this neighborhood in 1967. From 1967, then, when Israel occupied East Jerusalem, the city was more or less entirely put under Israeli occupation, with Israel especially determined to make Jerusalem its capital. In order to achieve this objective, Israel continues to employ a series of so-called Judaization policies in Jerusalem, which aim to change the demographic composition of the city so that the majority is at least 60% Jewish Israeli. Change the demographic composition is kind of a euphemism, because essentially what this means is that the continued massacre and forced displacement of Palestinians is required to diminish the Palestinian population, while the continued encouragement of settlement in Jerusalem is required to facilitate this displacement. Ayad Barghouti tells Al-Majdal, there are 4 general pillars of the policies and practices of Judaization in the Palestinian cities within the Green Line: Jaffa, Haifa, Al-Lid, Ramle, Nazareth, and Akka. Tightening the noose around the Arab Palestinian residents of these cities by policies of economic, cultural, and social marginalization, discrimination in the provision of services, and law enforcement, all aimed at reducing Palestinian quality of life to the point where Palestinians voluntarily, quote-unquote, leave their old neighborhoods. Then there's erasing the Arab-Palestinian identity of the city by practices of writing out the Palestinian in the official histories of the place, systematic neglect and demolition of old Palestinian buildings, and the Hebraization of the names of public spaces and streets. Then the seizure of Palestinian homes and real estate through governmental agencies and corporations, through legislation and policies that hinder inheritance right for Palestinians, maintenance of Palestinian control over Muslim and Christian religious endowments, and facilitate the transfer of property titles to Zionist capital and institutions. And finally, the transformation of very old Palestinian neighborhoods into tourist and cultural attractions, notably artists' colonies, emptied of the indigenous residents and transferring ownership of larger buildings and landmarks to Jewish tourism entrepreneurs. So essentially, Judaization policies are aimed at removing Palestinians by any means necessary and installing Jewish settlers in their place. These policies were at the center of what was happening in Sheikh Jarrah, the neighborhood in Jerusalem, in 2021, which caught the internet's attention with the hashtag #SaveSheikhJarrah. So in Jerusalem today, Palestinians are dispossessed of their land through home demolitions, land confiscations, and more. Khalil Tafakji earlier refers to Israel's absentee property law, which was created in 1950, and deems the properties of displaced Palestinians now the property of the Israeli state, which enables the building of Jewish-only settlements to continue on stolen Palestinian land. So, one sense of movement here, which is applicable broadly to the Palestinian experience, is displacement, being violently forced to leave your home because conditions are so unlivable, or because you're literally under threat of death. Another sense of movement is in its restriction, which is achieved primarily through the checkpoint system and the apartheid wall. Khalil Tafakji tells us, there is also a housing crisis that the wall has created. Israel systematically strips Palestinians of their Jerusalem residency if they cannot show that they are habitually resident within Jerusalem. As such, there is a frenzy of people moving into increasingly overcrowded and overpriced housing within the already overcrowded Palestinian neighborhoods in order to keep their Jerusalem residency status. Without this status, Palestinians are forced to acquire West Bank residency, which means they can no longer enter the city without military permits, and they can no longer receive health, family, and retirement benefits for which they've been paying taxes for as long as they've been Jerusalem residents. The result is that those unwilling or unable to move into the city have lost their residency status, and that there has been a serious deterioration of Palestinian quality of life for those within the city. That is to say, many Palestinians try to hold on to their homes in Jerusalem in the face of Israeli policies. Israel's restriction of movement makes this very difficult for them. If they leave Jerusalem, they won't be allowed to enter again. Those who don't leave are made to live in a constant state of insecurity, poverty, inequality, and constant threat of terror and violence, as the Israeli military routinely engages in collective punishment, arbitrary arrests, and more. And all the while, Israel continues to expand the borders of Jerusalem and build settlements on Palestinian land and in the West Bank. What is the apartheid wall that we mentioned? By 2006, Israel completed construction on a so-called separation barrier, which is a nice euphemism for racial segregation wall, around the West Bank and in some parts within the West Bank, in response supposedly to the Second Intifada. Intifada just means uprising in Arabic, against Israeli occupation. The apartheid wall contributes to the physical separation of Palestinians from one another and severe restriction of their movement, creating a scenario where Palestinians living outside of Jerusalem who might depend on the city for housing or schooling are prevented from doing so. Imagine if it was this difficult for you to make your daily journey to work from the commuter belt to central London. The apartheid wall works in tandem with the Israeli checkpoint system and ID system. Manned by Israeli military and border police, who are often conscripted, trigger-happy teenagers high on racist propaganda and the ability to commit racist violence with impunity, Palestinians have to show the relevant ID in order to move. Israel has a stratified population registry, what one might call a feature of an apartheid state, with Jewish Israeli ID at the top, as the basic law of Israel enshrines that only Jewish people have the right to self-determination. Then you have Palestinian citizens of Israel who don't have the same rights as Jewish citizens and face a series of discriminatory laws. East Jerusalem Palestinian ID is a precarious residency status which can be revoked by Israel at any time, with tens of thousands revoked over the decades and many unregistered because it's just so difficult to obtain one. West Bank Palestinians have green IDs and are only allowed to live on 40% of West Bank land, the rest of which is being colonized by Jewish Israelis who are building Jewish-only settlements there. Palestinians have to use specific roads and buses which are segregated from Israeli Jewish ones. Finally, a Palestinian with a Gaza ID is simply not able to move to the West Bank, and they are also surrounded by both a physical barrier and an international blockade. There's no airport in Gaza, so either you leave via Egypt or via Israel, neither of which is particularly easy. And if you leave as a Palestinian, your chances of being allowed back in are precarious. In other words, your ID determines your level of freedom, particularly your freedom of movement, with Jewish Israelis being able to move and act completely unrestricted, while Palestinians face a tiered system which restricts their freedom of movement and fragments them from one another. The manning of checkpoints enforces the system, especially because Israel both restricts movement and forces Palestinians to move. Perhaps a Palestinian man could only get a job in Jerusalem, but he can't live there or he has family there. Israel exploits Palestinian labor while manufacturing Palestinian dependency on Israeli jobs and products, so thousands of Palestinian workers cross Israeli military checkpoints on their way to their workplaces every day. Many of these checkpoints are overcrowded and people have been crushed to death in them. Sometimes people queue as early as 3 a.m. in the morning or sleep overnight by the checkpoint with the hope of making it across. According to the UN, there are over 500 roadblocks and checkpoints obscuring Palestinian movement in the West Bank, which doesn't include an additional hundreds of temporary flying checkpoints. The city of Akka was a major seaport for a large amount of Palestinian history, including becoming the main seaport for the Frankish states after it was first occupied by them in 1104. Akka was the last Frankish stronghold to be liberated in 1291, and in 1799 Napoleon thought he'd give conquering it a try too, but the indigenous Palestinians successfully resisted him. In 1947, as mentioned earlier, Akka was meant to be part of a sovereign Palestinian state in the UN partition plan, but it was occupied by Israel and is now part of the settler colony of Israel 48, or occupied Palestine. Palestinians living here will have blue IDs, but as Palestinian citizens of Israel, they are second-class citizens with movement and freedom restricted on their own ancestral land. Ayad Barghouti writes about Akka today. The vast majority of Akka's indigenous Palestinian residents, as well as those who had sought refuge in the walled city after their communities had been depopulated by Zionist forces, mostly from Haifa and the towns and villages of Western Galilee, were expelled from Akka during the 1948 Nakba. This despite the city being considered part of the Arab-majority state proposed in the 1947 UN partition plan. Arab Palestinians still live in the old city of Akka with their buildings, cultural, religious, and historic sites largely intact as a result of these Palestinian residents' tireless efforts. With the exception of Nazareth, Akka is the only historic Palestinian city within the Green Line where this is the case. For various reasons, this strong Palestinian presence in Akka is an uncomfortable fact for Zionist and Israeli authorities who've expanded and escalated their Judaization efforts in the city over recent years. Something interesting to note in the Akka context is how Israel has branded the city as a crusader city, something which Ayad Barghouti unpacks a bit here. The branding or rebranding campaign announced by the Akka municipality at the outset of 2008 aims to change the character and marketed image of the city from a crusader city into a Mediterranean city. In both cases, the Palestinian, Arab, and Ottoman character of the city is completely ignored and sidelined, and in both cases the municipality and the Ministry of Tourism have done all in their power to hide the fact that today's Akka, with its historic and distinctive architecture, is the city that was rebuilt by Tahir Omar al-Zidani over the ruins of the Crusader city, a project that was continued by Ahmed Pasha al-Jazar and the rulers that followed him until the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the onset of the British occupation. In fact, the UNESCO recognition of Akka as a World Heritage Site came as a result of an Israeli application for this recognition. The core of the Israeli application was that the old city of Akka is a living example of an Ottoman port city, which has preserved its cultural life since the Ottoman period, in addition to the important Crusader architecture. Akka was the capital of the Second Crusader Kingdom. The Israeli authorities who made the application made sure not to use the word Arab, let alone Palestinian, in the UNESCO application, in spite of the fact that the actual residents of Akka's old city have been Arab throughout the city's history, and despite the Arab identity of Tahir Omar himself, the initiator of the first Arab political independence movement in Palestine in the modern period, and who had chosen Akka as his capital. This certainly points to the way in which the Crusades are shaped in the Zionist imagination as well as romantic and even aspirational. To summarize, why does Israel police Palestinian movement in this way? Essentially, it enables Israel's long-term settler colonial goals. As we can see with what's currently happening in Gaza, corralling as many Palestinians as possible into a tiny physical space makes Israel's genocidal aims easier to accomplish. As we can see in the West Bank, Jerusalem, and in the settler colony of Israel 48, the checkpoint system, apartheid wall, ID system, and Judaization policies are aimed at making life as unlivable as possible for Palestinians by restricting their freedoms and their movement, in order to force them to move out of Palestine. My hope is that when you play or replay Assassin's Creed and move across the virtual space of Palestine, you will now inevitably consider the undoubtedly political implications of movement in Palestine then and now, virtually and physically. In this essay, I wanted to talk about Assassin's Creed from a perspective I'd never seen it discussed, tackling head-on the fact that Assassin's Creed not only represents parts of historic Palestine, but offers them up as spaces to navigate, to move through. With Assassin's Creed being one of the most famous game franchises in the world today, and with its fame starting here, it only feels right to use the opportunity to draw our attention to the struggle for Palestinian liberation. When it comes to movement in games, or game design in general, limitation isn't inherently bad. In the first place, it just isn't possible to make a game without some kind of limitation, right? There's only so much you can do as developers, especially when resources are limited, and there's only so much someone will be able to do in a virtual world. So I think really compelling games often use this very fact that games necessarily have limitations to their advantage. I argued earlier that Assassin's Creed's slightly messy conceit about the Animus could be read as highlighting some of the interesting dynamics between player and avatar that emerge from video games, and that's something to be explored. For example, Life is Strange is a game that a lot of people complain about for its limitations, but to my mind it cleverly uses these very limitations to create a compelling interactive experience about the very nature of choice. Assassin's Creed certainly could have been a better game if it had gone in that direction, but the franchise is ultimately caged by capitalism, caught in the neoliberal paradigm of trying to appeal to as many players as possible and churn out successful products fast. Whoever said that capitalism breeds innovation was lying, because ultimately this is boring, repetitive, and ideologically dangerous, as well as materially dangerous, as we've discussed with regards to the game's narrative and design, and how features of it end up feeding into dominant Zionist narratives, as well as the grueling conditions of work in the gaming industry. It's sort of impossible not to think of the parallels between the Frankish Crusades and modern Zionism. Very recently I watched The Prince of Egypt, which certainly has a Zionist undertone in its interpretation of the Book of Exodus, and the talk of going to a promised land, which is a land of milk and honey, made me think of the use of these phrases in Zionist propaganda, of course, but also in Pope Urban II's speech that I quoted earlier, rallying the Europeans to escape their poverty and their sin by colonizing Jerusalem. Using limitations on movement within games holds a lot of potential for creating interesting and politically important stories and experiences about navigating Palestine, and about the continuities between historic Palestine during the Frankish occupation and Palestine today during the Zionist occupation. Resist, Resist, Resist by Infinite Tears, developed as an entry for the Towards a Free Palestine game jam that we co-hosted, uses limited resources and limited time superbly by creating a bizarre yet visceral construction of the occupied West Bank, in which movement is highly restricted, but within its claustrophobic confines you reach for the tools to resist this oppression. In doing so, it brings attention not only to the experiences of confinement faced by many Palestinians, but also the ability to find seeds of hope and resistance, which may seem small at first, but cumulatively bring us to liberation. The game ends on a vibrant, hopeful note for the future, represented through a joyful, heightened space of a free Palestine, without walls and without soldiers, full of colour and endless space to move and to breathe. Beyond the content of these games, though, how do we within the gaming industry support Palestine? There is fighting censorship, making space for Palestinian voices to be heard within the games industry, but the issue of Palestinian voices in gaming, as I talked about earlier, is also undeniably material. If people are being bombarded with the aim of ushering them out of existence, where is the space for creativity? And even if Palestinians living throughout historic Palestine always had access to basic necessities, food, water, shelter, sanitation, gaming is a unique medium in many ways, one of which is the need for resources. Can you access a PC or a console to play games, let alone to make them? It's worth stating the obvious, our creativity is especially stifled in such circumstances, true, but it's not just creativity, it's resources and material conditions. So if we really care about freedom of expression, then settler colonialism, apartheid, and occupation cannot continue to exist. It's easy to feel helpless, but there are some things we can do. We can fight the militarization of the games industry, which I talk about a lot in our video on neocolonialism. This will deal tangible blows to the Israeli settler colonial project by depriving it of funding and weapons to carry out its violence. We can mobilize around BDS, or boycott, divestment, sanctions, a call from Palestinian civil society to the international community, urging us to boycott Israeli goods, divest from Israeli institutions, and sanction the Israeli government. The three core demands of the BDS movement are equal rights for Palestinian citizens living in 48, an end to the military occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip, and the right of return for all Palestinian refugees to their homelands. A big one which can have really enormous effects in the context of games is Intel. Intel has recently been added to the BDS list, so we need to advocate staunchly for the boycott of Intel computer parts and computers that use Intel parts, and to end any and all ties to Intel. We can look to our game development and journalism workplaces, and we can get organized, working with unions like IWGB Game Workers to gain autonomy over our workplaces, which gives us the control to make these decisions ourselves about who we're partnering with, who we're investing in. We can be loud and proud in our support of Palestinian liberation, which makes it safer for Palestinian voices, and we can support projects like Arabic Games and Gaming Academy, which educate and amplify the voices of Swana game developers, and which helps Swana Games communities prosper by facilitating access to professional advice, publishing opportunities, jobs, and more, in an industry which is unfortunately hostile, racist, and deeply unequal. On this note, I want to take the opportunity to highlight some Palestinians working in the games industry for you to support. These are just some of the folks I've had the chance to chat to. Please do check out their incredible work, and I'll include their socials in the description below and where relevant on screen. First, creative director Rasheed Abueideh is a Palestinian game developer best known for Layla and the Shadows of War, a 2014 mobile title that depicted the chronicles of a young girl and her family during the 2014 Gaza war. The game was downloaded over 2 million times and sits at a well-deserved 4.9 star rating. Layla and the Shadows of War was critically well received, winning prestigious awards as the game selected for showcases at industry-leading events such as Indiecade, Amaze, and Pocket Gamer Connect. Rasheed's development was further honoured by a speaking opportunity at the Games Developer Conference 2017, during which his groundbreaking talk was received by the audience with a sustained standing ovation. Layla and the Shadows of War was developed as freeware, partially because the priority of the project was communicating the Palestinian realities during the 2014 wars, but an additional consideration was that Palestinians were not allowed to make revenue from the App Store and Google Play Store. During Israel's 2021 invasion of Gaza, Layla and the Shadows of War was ported to PC and added to the highly successful Games for Palestine bundle, which raised almost $900,000 for humanitarian aid in Gaza. Personally, I played this game on PC. It's short but deeply, deeply impactful, and I really recommend taking 15 minutes of your time to play it. It just does an incredible job of taking a format that we all know, the platformer, and creating just really visceral emotional effects with it. You can't see me reacting to the game here. This was the first time that I played it, this recording, but while I cried, I really felt it in my chest at moments when I played this game. Please do check it out. Next, Ramsey, also known by his artist name Marskye, is a composer and musician who's written various soundtracks for games, mostly indie. He's ethnically Arab, specifically Palestinian, born in the USA, but at a young age raised in Kuwait. His mum is from Gaza and his father from Akka, respectively. Currently, he's just outside of Seattle, Washington. His most known works are Boyfriend Dungeon, Thirsty Suitors, Nog, and Lara Croft Go, Mirror of Spirits. At the moment, he's currently working with Outer Loop Games, whose most recent release, Thirsty Suitors, is a cool blend of different genres. I've been streaming it recently, so I can personally attest to that. Marskye describes it as an RPG breakup simulator with a queer POC-focused narrative, sort of like if Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, Persona, and Yakuza had a baby. He composed the soundtrack, which I've been listening to on repeat. I feel like someone reached into my brain and wrote music that would scratch it exactly right. Marskye's music can be heard on Bandcamp, YouTube, Spotify, and on all popular streaming services. I asked Marskye if he had any sentiments to share about Palestine in games, and these were his words. I consider myself lucky because my personal experience myself has been largely positive working with game devs from a Palestinian perspective. Personally, I've not faced discrimination for being Palestinian in games as of yet. I do post about Palestine, so it's possible that I'm already blocked from having certain opportunities, hard to say. Given that, as a minority group, I consider ourselves to be largely invisible within the medium. Not only as artists and engineers, but within game narratives and story arcs in general, behind the scenes as writers or as shot callers. That can go for most media in general as well. Arabs as a group are a minority presence in games, and what little representation we've received, generally speaking, has been stereotypical or negative. It's nothing new in 2024, and unfortunately it's because of how normalized it is. I almost don't think about how non-existent we are as real human people with real stories to tell. When people ask me what to share or do, or what sentiment to have for Palestinians or Palestine in general, I always respond with the same thing. Please share the facts. The issue with this quote-unquote conflict is that there is a very open and deliberate attempt to smear Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims, as well as skew and blur the truth in order to justify crimes against humanity. This agenda and misreporting has turned definitions that were once concrete now open to interpretation. Terms such as collective punishment, apartheid, crimes against humanity, and genocide are washed of the harsh language and even reversed and weaponized on the victims in some cases. It's not unusual to see mainstream media report things such as, "This was brought on ourselves, Palestinians deserve this, Israel has a right to protect themselves, and can even murder children with impunity. Hamas are terrorists and terrorism is barbaric, so Palestinians are barbaric," and so on and so forth. To add to this, the US is vetoing every resolution and therefore normalizing the context in which these crimes are happening. There's a clear agenda, often being referred to as a war rather than wholesale slaughter between the oppressor and the oppressed, as well as selectively excluding facts or details that make up the story. This is what needs to be combated and fought against, so they cannot be subjective about numbers, treaties, UN resolutions, or dates. The numbers have told a very clear story that cannot be reconciled with the mainstream narrative. That's where the dissonance happens. It's very easy to see the statistics and see the bleak reality Palestinians are living through. Anyone who sees human rights reports, the UN reports, the condemnation from the world, the disproportionate response, and somehow manages to think, but Hamas or terrorists, when confronted with 90% of children in Gaza have PTSD, or 70% of people are experiencing catastrophic hunger in northern Gaza right now as I type this, is living in an alternate reality where human rights are not the priority. The latter statement is literally from today's headlines, by the way. This was March 18th. So there's no shortage of documented crime. It's a topic that's been subconsciously ingrained into my head from a really young age. My entire extended family is a product of the 1948 Nakba. I have numerous stories about family members blocked from immigration, getting visas, experiencing routine discrimination, institutionalized racism from neighboring Arab countries, the USA, and more. So I have a close and personal attachment to the current events and genocide, and the current events are not as much shocking to me as they are numbing and haunting, and more of a mask-off moment. Next is Natalie Gedeon. Natalie was born and raised in California, and she's a user researcher in the gaming industry. She's worked on a variety of projects by running playtests and partnering with developers on design solutions and overall strategy. In addition to her full-time work, she supports her partner's indie racing game, Star Racer, with game design and writing. Reflecting on being Palestinian in the gaming industry, Natalie wanted us to share with you, in her words, "As a granddaughter of displaced Palestinians from the Nakba in 1948, I'm immensely proud to be Palestinian. But I've also been taught from a very young age that it was safer to hide this part of myself because the world has been taught to hate it. So to be Palestinian also means hiding a part of who you are, even in the gaming industry. To be Palestinian and Arab in games means to constantly see yourself in the crosshairs of a gun's reticle. To be a Palestinian in the gaming industry is to read statements by executives that sympathize with one side of a quote-unquote conflict and spares no words of empathy with your community that is also suffering. It is not always easy to be Palestinian and Arab, especially in an industry that frequently portrays the Arab as the enemy, the evil that must be overcome, the terrorist to be eliminated. As the Palestinian philosopher and scholar Edward Said once wrote, the Arab is always shown in large numbers, no individuality, no personal characteristics or experiences. Most of the pictures represent mass rage and misery, or irrational, hence hopelessly eccentric, gestures. Lurking behind all of those images is the menace of jihad. As a lifelong gamer, I am so happy to see how this industry has expanded the definition of who a gaming protagonist looks like over the years. It is my hope that we continue this trajectory and, perhaps one day, have our industry embrace more Palestinian stories too, past and modern. To see stories that reflect how I see my community, how I see my own grandparents, stories of resilience, of passion, of selflessness, stories that show that we are worthy of living too. Last but not least, Nadia Shammas is a Palestinian-American comics and games writer. She's best known for being the writer and co-creator of Squire, a Harvey Award-winning YA Middle Eastern fantasy graphic novel, co-created with Sara. Their other original work includes Where Black Stars Rise, an adult eldritch horror graphic novella, co-created with Marie Enger. They've also worked on Ms. Marvel's Stretched Thin and on other Marvel, DC Comics, IDW Publishing, First Second, Tor Nightfire, Penguin Random House, and HarperCollins titles. In games, Nadia is known for her work as a writer on Thirsty Suitors, which I've already gassed up at length, and This Is Normal, a short free educational game about self-managed abortion with pills at home, which is super important and informative and only takes 10 to 15 minutes to play. These were Nadia's poignant words for us on this topic. I genuinely think that Palestine is the final linchpin on which the worst aspects of our capitalist, colonialist society exists on. We're seeing it now, for example with the encampments and colleges, that one of the biggest things is not to demand simply a divestment from Israel, but also to demand they disclose. To specifically say, we are paying you 5 figures a year or semester even to get an education. Where is our money going? And the fact that these universities refuse to admit how much money is invested in weapons sales with Israel specifically should be a flag for people. How much money is wrapped up in this? And the truth is, a huge portion of the economy is in militarization, and that includes stuff that we have at home and use regularly. It's part of our infrastructure in a way that it becomes impossible to avoid sometimes. Unity has military contracts, and most games I've worked on use Unity engine. So the thing about Palestine is, it's invisible and yet unavoidable. We are not separate, we are not distant. The consequences of the ongoing destruction of Palestine has created the rot eating away at our lives. And I think that's what's so harrowing about the purposeful blindness and silence from so many of our peers. We use unity and so does the military. Do you understand how important that is? Do you understand how much that ties every aspect of our culture back to militarism, back to weapons, back to colonialism? If we are experiencing massive layoffs, if we are experiencing mass theft in our creative industries, if we're experiencing huge waves of silencing, if the conditions are becoming so hostile, so specifically and so purposefully, it is because of what the other hand is doing. It's not unrelated. If we stop this, if we stop engaging, we won't suffer in the way that we do. Maybe because I'm new to games, I find it really difficult to square people really buying into a sense of decorum and legacy. We are what give these institutions meaning, and if those institutions don't represent us, then we need to stop giving it air. Personally, I think if all of us just ignored the Game Awards, it would fucking stop in 2 years. I think that we should do that. I think it's kind of embarrassing that we don't. I find the way the Game Awards uses Future Class as marketing or shields against criticism to be really upsetting. I promise these spaces don't deserve you. You're already doing the work, and on top of that, they need a collected list of nominations. They can't even do their own search. People hold a lot more power individually than they think they do. This is a mass culling, and we can't go back to these studios. We have to do something else. And I feel the same way about Israel. You've had 75 years to govern and you've shown you can't fucking do it, so we can't engage with you anymore on that level. There are military connections in our games, in our education, in our culture. Why? The thing that's incredible about game design is that nothing just happens. Every single thing has to be processed, implemented. You even need to have a language to talk to the fucking systems. It's so meticulous, and when a game is really good and really effective, it feels as though this is how the world is, and this is the only way that it can work. It feels complete. And that is propaganda. It presents the world in a way that makes it seem like there was no other way that this world could function. But our world is not like that. Nothing about our world is inherent. It's just presented to us that way. The only thing that is inherent are the laws of nature, life and death. But the hierarchy, that's not real. That's the thing I'm most interested in as a Palestinian creative, honestly. Building worlds and building systems. What are the structures of the world, and how can you either uplift or disrupt those structures? No one is just born. We're all born with a million ties on us already, and that's what makes games interesting. You as a character, you starting a game, are born with already a bunch of different inherent limitations and baggage. When it works, it's effective. When we look at this world, when people talk about Israel-Palestine, it's packaged in such a way that this is a natural and inevitable way. This is how it has to be. But that's not true. If you look at history, there are a million places that the fort could have taken us somewhere completely different. It's just choice. Doing good is an ongoing thing that needs to be upheld by generations of people, not just one. The thing about being Palestinian is that you do not get to see anything about yourself outside of the actual community and family you grew up in, because you are not allowed to appear under the context other than dying, killing, or suffering. And when you only see Palestinians in that context, you stop being able to imagine them doing anything else. When you think of a Palestinian, you think of a dead child in the rubble. Why? because that's what you've seen your whole life. Not just me, but everyone. Most people don't even know what Palestinian is. My mom and I were joking about it, that usually if we tell people I'm from Palestine, they go, "Oh yeah, Pakistan." Whenever I have a Pakistani Uber driver, we joke about that everybody mixes us up. But that's significant, it's important. Why? Have you considered why? Why don't you know this thing? Why is it like this? Not because it's natural, but because it's constructed this way. They do not make you feel like Palestinians can do anything other than die, do violence, or suffer, generally. They're not people at that point, and they've never been represented as people. That's kind of the thing about being Palestinian. Representation is really important in the sense of making people realize that their preconceived structures aren't real at all. I have been many people's first Palestinian. I've changed a lot of people's minds on the conflict. It makes me really good at educating people, but it also fucking kills me to have to reassert my humanity to strangers and to people who I care about over and over again. I've lost a lot of friends during this, particularly because I noticed that a lot of the friends I spent years educating, a lot of them were just fucking silent now. Then why? Why did I put so much time and effort into you? So that you could seem like a good person, not because you actually cared? That's the double-edged sword with representation. I know representation's important. It's why I do what I do. It's why I write the books I write. It's why I want to make the games I make. I want to break the limit of the world that has been placed on Black, Indigenous, and Palestinian folks especially. But I do not want to be the Palestinian. We have this fucked up thing in the DEI spaces where they're like, hey, if we get this one person to stardom, then that's representative and basically the same as getting every other person who's like that person to stardom, and some use that to their advantage, but overall it just messes with your head and your work. I've won awards for my book Squire. When we were first putting it together, they didn't want us to put Arabic in the book because they felt like it was a political language. They didn't want to take on the book because they didn't want to seem like they were taking a stance by hiring a Palestinian. I was 25, I didn't have social media really, and I had nothing indicating that I was a hardcore Palestinian. I was just Palestinian, and that was enough to have me have to answer questions to racist editors for hours. I posted the email that I got about that first weekend after October 7th. We spent 4 years pushing through all of that. We kept Arabic in the book. The book came out philosophically and politically exactly what we wanted. We won an award. I said Free Palestine at the end of the award. I thanked the comics community. I told them they saved my life. And then this happens. And all those fucking people are nowhere. And I realized, I know I did something with this book because I meet people, especially young Arab girls, who love this book. It means the world to them. But it did not save the life of any child in Gaza. My success did not save them. So what is it worth? I would give up anything to have them back. It's hard for it all not to feel like the representation bit is pretty hollow, and it's pretty much a ladder for whoever can get there to be the Highlander of that particular marginalized group. Representation can't just be like, we got that person and now we're good. They get to do the stuff for that. No, we need systems. We need cooperatives. We need communities. This cannot go on. That's kind of the thing about representation. It is so viciously important for Palestinians because we are so viciously dehumanized. I want to create stories for me and my people and do anything I can to continue the work of my people. But I don't want to accept this position of, if you hire me, then your game is no longer anti-Palestinian. That's not true. I think about how pushed out people of colour have become since this all started in October, not just Palestinians, and I think that's very meaningful to show the way in which the anti-Palestinian hate has now started to grow into kind of a greater frenzy against all racialized people. I think we're going to see more of a cultural split, kind of almost like a two different realities kind of thing, where you're going to see the people who want to stick to tradition, kind of keeping alive those institutions, keeping them going. And then there's going to be people who can't. And I assure you, it's going to be really interesting. I think you're going to find that the old guard institutions are just really static all of a sudden for the next few years. And then there's going to be a much larger underground where the rest of us live. I genuinely think that's where we're coming to a point where games as it is right now are completely uninhabitable for marginalized people. For anyone, honestly, but especially marginalized people. The most established, wealthy, and out-of-touch directors with the right credits will find their jobs. They'll find their positions. Those jobs will never be posted on boards. But the rest of us are going to be pushed out of AAA or whatever, and we're going to have to do something else. I'm hoping to see a lot more innovation in the space, but I definitely think mainstream media is about to get more static and traditional. That's fine. I hope the folks who are mad at our inclusion genuinely get the work they're pushing so hard for. For the rest of us, though, it's up to us to survive, to make it without repeating the same neoliberal mistakes. We're in for some weird shit. To finally wrap up this video, next time you find yourself playing Assassin's Creed, taking a leisurely stroll in the city of Jerusalem without material fear or danger to stop you, think about what you can do, what we all collectively can do, to secure for Palestinians such a basic human freedom, the right to a leisurely stroll in the home of your ancestors. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. If you enjoyed it, please do give it a like, and be sure to comment, let us know what you thought. As always, a huge thank you to our patrons who make videos like this possible. We genuinely couldn't do this without you. If you aren't a patron already, please do consider supporting us over at patreon.com/GameAssistYT. We also have a Ko-fi or Coffee, I never know how to pronounce that. The point being that if a one-off donation works better for you, then that's the platform for that. Catch us over on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook for further discussions and conversations. And as always, thank you for watching. Free Palestine from the river to the sea, and take care of yourself.